In 1954, college students were paid to lie in soundproof boxes at McGill University. Within hours, they started screaming to get out. What they experienced was so disturbing that the CIA immediately took interest. This is the true story of isolation experiments that shattered human minds. Donald Hebb wanted to know what happens when you strip away someone's senses. He built isolation chambers where students wore goggles that blurred their vision, cardboard tubes on their arms so they couldn't feel anything, and foam pillows that muffled all sound. They just had to lie there. Easy money, right? Wrong. Within 24 hours, the students couldn't think straight. They couldn't concentrate. Then the hallucinations started. They saw rocks floating in midair, eyeglasses, babies crawling on the ceiling. They heard full choirs singing in stereophonic sound. One student felt his skin crawling with invisible insects. Another felt like he'd been shot with pellets. Their minds were creating an entire reality that didn't exist. But here's where it gets darker. The students who made it past day one started experiencing something Hebb called depersonalization. They felt detached from their own limbs. They lost track of who they were. Some couldn't tell where their body ended and the room began. The longest anyone lasted was just a few days before they were banging on the walls, begging to be released. The results were so shocking that a psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron saw an opportunity. He took Hebb's research and cranked it to 11. Cameron started locking psychiatric patients in isolation for weeks without telling them when it would end. He called it psychic driving. His patients called it torture. Many never recovered. Meanwhile, in France, a geologist named Michel Siffre decided to test isolation on himself. In 1962, he descended into an underground cave with no clock, no calendar, no sunlight. He planned to stay 2 weeks. He stayed 2 months. Living in total darkness, 430 feet below the surface, Siffre's perception of time completely shattered. When he thought 5 minutes had passed, it had been an hour. His sleep cycle stretched to 48 hours instead of 24. But the psychological effects were worse. Siffre reported periods of complete mental instability, overwhelming guilt, crushing loneliness. He became so desperate for companionship that he tried to befriend a mouse in the cave, even though he was terrified of disease. When he finally emerged, he was a different person. He swore he'd never go back. 10 years later, he broke that promise. In 1972, Siffre locked himself in Midnight Cave in Texas for 6 months. This time, the isolation nearly destroyed him. He suffered acute psychological trauma that he never fully recovered from. His marriage fell apart. He went into debt. The man who wanted to understand human limits had found them, and they broke him. Back in the lab, researchers kept pushing. In 2008, the BBC recreated Hebb's experiments, isolating 6 volunteers in a former nuclear bunker for just 48 hours. Every single one of them hallucinated. They saw oyster shells, snakes, zebras, tiny cars. One person watched the room take off like a spaceship. Another saw fighter planes buzzing around their head. After just 2 days, they showed severe anxiety, paranoia, and significant mental deterioration. These weren't people with pre-existing conditions. These were healthy volunteers who knew the experiment would end. Now imagine what happens in solitary confinement, where prisoners spend 22 to 24 hours a day in 6 by 9 foot cells, sometimes for years, with no idea when it will stop. Psychiatrist Stuart Gracian identified what he called SHU syndrome, named after special housing units. The symptoms: progressive inability to tolerate ordinary sounds, severe panic attacks, hallucinations that start within hours and become more elaborate over time, obsessive thoughts, paranoia, memory loss, violent fantasies, and a complete breakdown of impulse control. People in solitary confinement make up only 6 to 8% of the prison population, but they account for half of all prison suicides. Half. The isolation doesn't just damage their minds during confinement. Studies show that any amount of time in solitary increases the risk of death in the first year after release. The damage is permanent. In one study, over 40% of people in solitary confinement reported hallucinations and irrational anger, compared to less than 2% in normal prison conditions. Their brains were literally creating threats that didn't exist, because the absence of stimulation was more terrifying than any real danger. The human brain isn't designed for isolation. We're social creatures. When you remove all sensory input, all human contact, all sense of time and space, the mind turns on itself. It starts filling the void with phantoms, with voices, with terror. What these experiments proved is that isolation isn't just punishment. It's a form of psychological destruction that the United Nations now classifies as torture. The students in Hebb's boxes, the patients in Cameron's chambers, Siffre in his cave, they all discovered the same horrifying truth. The scariest place you can be is alone with your own mind when it has nothing left to hold on to. And once you've been there, you never fully come back.